Non-metallic metal has a reputation for being one of the hardest techniques in miniature painting. It is often presented as something that requires a deep understanding of reflections and countless hours of practice before you can get convincing results. But today I want to try a different approach. Instead of carefully blending every transition and placing every reflection by hand, we are going to see just how far we can get using a tool I have featured in the channel before: a simple makeup sponge. And the interesting part isn't whether this can replace traditional non-metallic metal. It is whether a much simpler approach can get us surprisingly close with a fraction of the effort. This idea actually came from a reel by Sleepy Slang, where they showcased this 45-minute paint job, and revealed that the bulk of the work was done with a makeup sponge, plus some highlights here and there. And while I have used makeup sponges in the past over more homogeneous models such as Space Marines, it never occurred to me to use one on the fantasy counterpart of a knight, where 80% of the model is armor. And through a sponge, not only can we work the volumes as we would on a Space Marine, but we can also stamp the paint so it only catches the smaller details of the armor. Now, a quick reminder when working with makeup sponges. We want them to be damp before picking up any paint, otherwise the paint will quickly dry inside of the sponge. I like not only to squeeze out the water throughoutly, as we do not want the sponge to be soaking wet, but also to dab it on a piece of cloth afterwards. This is important because for this model we are looking less for an airbrush-like finish and more of a stamp, and for that reason I'll only be diluting my paint a very tiny amount. This is because the more water there is in either the sponge or the paint itself, the more transparent the result becomes, which on smoother surfaces can be useful for achieving those soft airbrush-like transitions. But since today I mainly want to catch the filigree and the raised details of the armor, I want as little water in the mix as possible. A very light touch will also be key, where we do not press down at all. We want the paint to catch only on the raised details, rather than finding its way into the recesses. This first layer, however, where I am using my darkest color, is the most forgiving one. It is the perfect opportunity to test out the pressure and get a feel for the process. And if I make any mistakes or press down too hard, it won't have much of an impact in the end, as the color is still much darker than the highlights we'll be adding later. One thing when working with non-metallic metal is that the effect takes time to come together, especially at the beginning. It is only when we start adding those final highlights that things really start to click, so don't feel discouraged and push through those first layers. It will all come together in the end. As I move on to another layer, here is where the million-dollar question of where to place your highlights and shadows comes up. Something I myself used to struggle with quite a bit, as learning how reflection works can be quite overwhelming, even for intermediate painters. And while many tutorials better than mine can provide the theory, it is only through practice that we can truly start to understand how these things work. The problem is that practice, especially at the beginning, is messy. It's uncertain, and the results often don't look anything like we had in mind. That can be discouraging. But my solution, just as I talked about in my recent colorful underpainting videos, is to forget about the concept of non-metallic metal entirely. Instead, treat those surfaces as you would any other. This mindset removes the idea of right and wrong that we tend to develop around the advanced techniques, and replaces it with something much more familiar: simple layering and highlighting. But yes, the non-metallic metal effect will not look its best, and it might not even read as metal in some areas. But it will on some, and those small successes are where the real learning happens. Because when we focus too much on recreating the perfect effect, we often stop paying attention to what is actually happening on the miniature in front of us. We become so concerned with whether we are doing it correctly that we forget we are building a skill. And skills rarely arrive all at once. They are built through dozens of small observations. A highlight that worked, a reflection that looked convincing, a shadow that felt deeper than the last attempt. Each model teaches us something, not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. And over time, those little discoveries begin to accumulate, until one day, a technique that once felt impossible starts feeling natural. As I move on to the highlights, it is important to remember that when it comes to precision, removing excess paint from the brush is key. Not only will it help keep a fine tip, but it also gives you a much more controlled amount of paint that easily goes where you want to, rather than running around the model uncontrollably. From here on, it is simply a matter of picking out some edges here and there. Generally, if the first sponging was more general, and the second was a bit more intentional, you want to remain within that previous section. But more importantly, the smaller these highlights are, the more convincing the effect will be. Right now, I am using a mix of my previous grey alongside some ivory, but I will eventually push the brightest highlights towards pure ivory. For now, my only objective is to make these highlights just large enough so that I can fit a tiny dot or slash of pure ivory inside them later as the final specular highlight. Like I mentioned in the beginning, it is here that the effect finally starts to take shape, although in hindsight my color selection wasn't the best. While I did start from the same colorful underpainting tones that Sleepy used, mine probably should have been a bit darker to increase the overall contrast of the effect. Likewise, my highlight color could have been more interesting. Instead of these fairly neutral grays, introducing a slight bluish tint would have helped increase the contrast through temperature, particularly against the reddish tones underneath. Although in the end, I have to say I am very pleased with the results. While it didn't take me 45 minutes like Sleepy, I do not think I spent much more than an hour and a half on this model. And considering that, at the time of recording this, I had just come back from a 2-week vacation without touching a paintbrush, and had only 3 days to put together a video for the channel, this turned out to be a really fun experiment. A chance to warm up, try something new, and build a little momentum before tackling the bigger projects ahead. And sometimes that is exactly what we need. Not a masterpiece, not our best work. Just something that gets us excited to sit back down at the painting desk and start creating again. I hope you found this video helpful and that it made the idea of non-metallic metal feel a bit less intimidating. Before I go, I also want to thank you for sticking around these past few weeks. Between my vacation and getting back into the swing of things, the content hasn't been quite at the level I'd like, but I didn't want to stop the uploads altogether. The good news is that I have some exciting projects coming ahead. As always, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.